I had convinced myself that this job at Geomart was my launchpad. I was 22, fresh out of a 2-year retail management course that had felt like being trained for minor combat, and I told everyone I met that this was the real world finally handing me a chance. Geomart was enormous. Fluorescent rows, a deli that smelled like roasted garlic, and optimism. A break room with a vinyl couch that had seen better decades. My plan felt simple and adult. Steady paychecks, fewer ramen dinners, maybe a real set of plates that weren't still one chipped wedding gift from my mom. Hope, in my case, had the shape of a thrifted crockpot, an open spreadsheet labeled savings, and a neat stack of meal prep containers that made me feel like I was winning at life. Orientation was a blur of name tags and safety slides. My manager, Carla, had a laugh that softened the fluorescent lighting. She introduced me to the team like a new coffee flavor. Jenna, syrupy friendly, who always had a productivity app to recommend. Marcus, loud, perpetually polishing the morning's bad joke into something performance art adjacent. Tina, who worked nights and moonlighted as a piano teacher. And Omar, who had worked there for years and knew where the good discounts hid. Everyone was affable enough that the whole place felt like an accidental community. We joked about weird customers, swap before work playlists, and the lunchroom became its own small democracy where we traded advice and dessert crusts. Because it was my first real job, I might have been trying too hard to look like I had my life together. I prepped lunches like a person writing the next chapter of their career. Color-coded Tupperwares, a rigid rotation of proteins, and notes on my phone. Buy cilantro. I liked the ritual. Cooking, packing, labeling. There's something very satisfying about sealing your tiny domestic victories into plastic. My lunches felt private and precious in the way only newly responsible adults feel about anything they've earned. So when I opened the fridge and found an empty shelf where my lunch should have been, the first reaction was disbelief. I stood there for a beat, fluorescent light buzzing, fork frozen midair. Maybe I'd misremembered putting it in the big communal fridge instead of the small one. Maybe Carla had done some deep cleaning purge? There are useful myths we tell ourselves at first. That people make mistakes, that institutions are benign. So I checked under the magnet-covered calendar behind the yogurt tower. Nothing. The second time it happened, I told myself nerves were the culprit. The third time, embarrassment crept in. Maybe my label was dumb. Maybe my handwriting read like a dare. But by the fourth morning, when I unlatched the lid and realized someone had actually taken not one but 2 lunches from the exact spot I always used, the air of the break room changed. Possibility became pattern. That small private victory of packing a meal had been violated in the least romantic, most petty way possible. People reacted like people do when the small comfort of normal life is stolen, with immediate suspicion and a surprising level of melodrama. Jenna pretended to be above it, but kept peeking in the fridge like someone watching a soap opera. Marcus started calling it the Great Tupperware Heist in a voice that made it sound like performance art instead of theft. Tina made a joke about labeling with neon duct tape. Omar suggested a fridge rota with signatures like a school lunch program. Carla read the situation with managerial calm, and then, because managers can't help themselves, instituted fridge etiquette. Emails, gentle reminders, and a very earnest poster about respecting coworkers' food that somehow made the fridge feel more surveilled than before. Suspects multiplied. Everyone was a person with hands. Everyone carried a sandwich or a salad or an air of possible guilt. The new guy who started the same week as me. I'd learned his name, but I kept it private like a card pulled in a poker game, seemed nervous in a way that could mean innocence or excellent acting. Omar, with his discount knowledge and stale sunflower seeds, said nothing and therefore was suspicious by default. Jenna's productivity apps now included a list of people who steal lunches that she shared like she was curating a gallery. Marcus claimed he was above such petty theft, then deliberately microwaved fish and stared at the fridge, eyes narrowed like a detective in a bad movie. For a while, I tried to keep the hope alive that this was all temporary. Perhaps the new guy would confess. Perhaps Carla's poster would shame the thief into a moral epiphany. I taped my name on the lid in permanent marker and began to arrive earlier. a ritual doubling down on the idea that systems could solve violations of decency. But hope is fragile when it's anchored to a Tupperware empire. By the end of that first week, the pattern had teeth. Lunches disappeared on days when I was back-to-back on cash register, when the store busied itself with deliveries, when people's schedules overlapped like shadow puppets. The fridge, once a place of practical domesticity, had become a crime scene with glass containers instead of chalk outlines. That's when the little daydream of crockpots and real plates and steady savings started to look like a riddle I was going to have to solve, whether I wanted to or not. The stakes felt small and enormous at once. Not just dollars lost, but the principle that a person should be able to keep something they prepared with their own hands. The lunch thief had turned our shared community into a game of suspicion, and I was tired of playing. I lost count of how many times I walked past the fridge with a sandwich-shaped hole in my chest. It was 6 12-hour shifts in a row. 6 days where my lunch was gone and my options were the vending machine's existential sadness or whatever the deli had left after noon. I watched my paycheck tick up like a ledger of humiliation. Money out for someone else's tortillas. Dignity out for someone else's bite. By day 4, my annoyance had graduated to full-time resentment. By day 6, I had become a human spreadsheet of petty grievances. It's funny how small injustices compound. At first, it was a smirk and a passive-aggressive note, "Please don't eat my lunch," written in a font that tried to be stern and failed. Then someone started leaving their own unlabeled Tupperware. A tit-for-tat, which only made me label mine in block letters like a hostage negotiator. I tried practical measures, earlier arrivals, a strategically placed carton of milk as a decoy, even one of those ridiculous thermal bags that look like something you'd carry to a Comic-Con. Nothing stuck. Whoever it was treated the fridge like an honor system they hadn't read. My brain, which had been trained to organize inventory and manage petty stock shortages, went into problem-solving mode. There were a dozen evil plans that would have made a grade school prankster proud. Sticky notes, glitter, a passive-aggressive PowerPoint. But I'm not a grade school prankster. I wanted something decisive, a sting so memorable the thief would stop seeing our lunchroom as their personal buffet. It needed to be fast, unmistakable, and require no detective work afterward. The idea that kept circling back was absurd enough to feel like justice. Enter the Carolina Reaper, the gastronomic equivalent of a warning label. I didn't imagine hospital visits or heroic scenes. I imagined a single scorching lesson that would make anyone think twice before swiping someone else's lasagna. The logic in my head was disturbingly tidy. Make it over the top. Make it obvious. The thief wouldn't just lose a meal. They'd lose their appetite for future thefts. I remember feeling weirdly clinical about it, like a scientist plotting an experiment, rather than a person about to escalate a workplace feud. In the dark little corner of my brain that likes tidy outcomes, it was the fastest, most effective solution I could conjure. There was a sliver of moral debate, enough to make me roll my eyes at myself. I told myself I wasn't trying to hurt anyone, only to teach a lesson. I rehearsed non-violent endings where the bandit would apologize and hand back my Tupperware with a sheepish grin. But under the rehearsal rooms of rationalization, something else thrummed. The exhausted, simmering anger of a person who had spent a week buying their own lunch because someone else preferred my chicken over paying their own rent. That thundered louder than any ethics lecture. By the time I left the apartment that night, I had decided what my lesson would taste like. I treated that night like a ritual, not the kind that asks forgiveness, but the kind that demands attention. I went to bed angry and woke up angrier, which meant midnight became the right time to cook. The kitchen was small, my stove a faithful little thing that had seen more one-pan experiments than actual meals. But under the harsh light, it felt like an operating table. I rubbed my hands together the way I do when I'm about to do something that requires patience. There was a ridiculous satisfaction to planning the exact meal that would sit in the fridge the next morning. Something fragrant, something bright, something that would make anyone who saw it think, "That's a good lunch." Steak fajitas felt like a statement. Smoky, confident, obviously mine. I cooked like someone making an offering. The steak sizzled, the onions collapsed into sweet, translucent crescents, and the bell peppers softened until they looked like colored confessions. I threw in cumin and a little lime, not because I needed to be a chef, but because presentation counts when you're trying to bait a conscience. I rested the meat, shredded it into ribbons, and let the pan keep whispering the kind of smell that roots you to a place and a decision. The pico de gallo was the part I lingered over. Fresh tomatoes, red onion, a fistful of cilantro, a squeeze of lime, all of it bright and honest. Then there were the little peppers. I minced them with the same deliberate patience I had used to label my Tupperware, treating the knife like a metronome. The peppers had a sort of fierce perfume. Sharp, floral, the kind that announces itself before you know you've noticed it. I folded a small amount of that heat into the pico, letting the bright salsa drink it in until it glowed like a warning light. I didn't hide the fact that this was meant to be tempting. I arranged everything in the bowl like a painting. Steak piled into neat folds, peppers and onions draped just so, a ring of lime wedges, and a scattering of cilantro that made the whole thing look too good to be anonymous. I thought about how lunch is often eaten with your head down, in a 15-minute pocket stolen between chores and registers. I wanted whoever took it to feel they were stealing something worth stealing. When it came time to seal it, I did that part with ceremony. I chose a clear lid on purpose. Nothing sneaky, nothing that looked like it belonged in the dark. The transparency was the point. I wanted the fajitas to be visible, unmistakable, an unspoken dare nestled on the communal shelf. I wrote my name on the lid as usual in big, tidy letters and set the container in the spot I'd always used. For the first time since the lunches started disappearing, I felt like I had made a plan that matched the scale of my irritation. After I washed the skillet and wiped the counters, I stood in my kitchen for a long moment, half satisfied and half queasy. There was a loop of rationalizations running through my skull. Deterrent, lesson, poetic justice. And under that, a quieter, less tidy feeling that something uncompromising had been set in motion. I turned off the lights, went to bed, and tried to sleep with the odd, impatient certainty that by noon the next day, whatever happened next would be loud enough to end the game. The scream cut through the hum of the store like a dropped plate. It wasn't one of the bored, performative shrieks people do when they're pretending to be dramatic about a broken donut. It was raw, small, and urgent. I dropped the bag of oranges I'd been carrying to the floor and ran. By the time I shoved open the break room door, the room looked like a comic strip frozen on its worst frame. Coffee cups tipped, a microwave door swinging, Carla halfway off the vinyl couch with her badge still clipped to her shirt, Marcus making that terrible run and wave motion that men do when they want to look helpful and not like they might pass out. And on the floor, mouth open, eyes glassy, was Ethan. The guy who'd started the same week as me, the one who'd always had grease on his thumbs from the deli, who smiled like he was apologizing even when he hadn't done anything wrong. He was on his side, one hand clutching his throat, the other hand curled around the clear plastic lid of a container that smelled like my kitchen. The fajita bowl, the one I'd set out with the cilantro and the lime and the ridiculous care, sat open beside him, a bright, ridiculous altar of food and consequence. Steam had fogged the lid. A wedge of lime rolled away like a tiny planet. Someone had knocked a stack of napkins into a small constellation on the floor. Panic is an odd thing. It arrives as motion, people moving faster, voices getting higher, and as an instant inventory of consequences in your head. I heard Carla shout for someone to call 911. I heard Marcus bark at someone to find an inhaler. Someone was on the phone already, words clipped into the air. People clustered, forming a human wall. But still I could see Ethan's chest hitching, the way someone's breath looks like a broken promise. I bent down because that's what you do when someone needs help. I saw the tiny red flecks of salsa on his knuckles, the shine of oil on the steak ribbons, the scrape where his thumbnail had broken on the lip of the plastic. He wasn't trying to be dramatic. His face said there was 1,000 tiny needles behind his ribs. He opened his mouth to say something. Maybe I'm fine. Maybe help me. I don't know. And then he couldn't. The way his eyes searched the room felt like a rota of accusation, apology, and panic all at once. If guilt had a face, there it was, small, frightened, and sputtering. We got him an oxygen mask. An ambulance arrived with lights blurred by the parking lot rain, and people from the store clustered at the windows like a Greek chorus. I watched the EMTs lift him into the stretcher and fold him into that clinical cocoon of blankets and antiseptic. One of them, closed the door with a soft, careful hand. In that small second before the doors shut, his gaze flicked toward the open container on the floor, then to me. His look was lightning fast. Not a confession, not exactly, but a recognition. It was the look of someone who had been caught red-handed and suddenly realized the scale of what had been done. The ride to the hospital was the sort of thing that collapses hours into a cup of bitterness. I stood under the humming fluorescence of the staff room while Carla made calls and Marcus delivered a monologue that nobody asked for. People whispered theories, allergies, pepper sensitivity, a bad coincidence. But the facts were simple and terrible. Something in that bowl had set off an asthma attack big enough that he needed professional intervention. He was taken away and became a story with wheels. Later, in the quiet that comes after the noise, the day after hush of returning to register shifts and shelf tags and the mundane business of restocking, I learned that he'd be okay. That knowledge should have been salve. Instead, it was a new kind of weight. I sat on the vinyl couch and watched the spot where the fajitas had been, like a crime scene photograph on rewind. I could have told the whole truth then. What I'd cooked, why I'd chosen to be theatrical, how I'd thought a scorching mouth would teach a thief a lesson. I did not. Saying it aloud felt like making the injury more real, like handing the room a weapon it didn't ask for. No one ever accused me. Ethan never spoke about it. We never had a frank conversation about it. Ethan never said anything, and neither did I.